The Paradoxes of Mr. Pond by G.K. Chesterton. The Three Horsemen of the Apocalypse. The curious and sometimes creepy effect which Mr. Pond produced upon me, despite his commonplace courtesy and dapper decorum, was possibly connected with some memories of childhood and the vague verbal association of his name. He was a government official who was an old friend of my father, and I fancy my infantile imagination had somehow mixed up the name of Mr. Pond with the pond in the garden. When one came to think of it, he was curiously like the pond in the garden. He was so quiet at all normal times, so neat in shape, and so shiny, so to speak, in his ordinary reflections of earth and sky in the common daylight. And yet I knew were some queer things in the pond in the garden. Once in 100 times, on 1 or 2 days during the whole year, the pond would look oddly different, for there would come a flitting shadow, or a flash in its flat serenity, and a fish or a frog or some more grotesque creature would show itself to the sky. And I knew there were monsters in Mr. Pond also, the monsters in his mind which rose only for a moment to the surface and sank again. They took the form of monstrous remarks. In the middle of all his mild and rational remarks, some people thought he had suddenly gone mad in the midst of his sanest conversation, but even they had to admit that he must have suddenly gone sane again. Perhaps again this foolish fantasy was fixed in the youthful mind, because at certain moments Mr. Pond looked rather like a fish himself. His manners were not only quite polite, but quite conventional. His very gestures were conventional, with the exception of one occasional trick of plucking at his pointed beard, which seemed to come on him chiefly when he was at last forced to be serious about one of his strange and random statements. At such moments he would stare owlishly in front of him and pull his beard, which had a comic effect of pulling his mouth open, as if it were the mouth of a puppet with hairs for wires. This odd occasional opening and shutting of his mouth without speech had quite a startling similarity to the slow gaping and gulping of a fish, but it never lasted for more than a few seconds, during which, I suppose, he swallowed the unwelcome proposal of explaining what on earth he meant. He was talking quite quietly one day to Sir Hubert Lawton, the well-known diplomatist. They were seated under gaily striped tents or giant parasols in our own garden, gazing towards the pond, which I had perversely associated with him. They happened to be talking about a part of the world that both of them knew well, and very few people in Western Europe at all. The vast flats fading into fens and swamps that stretch across Pomerania and Poland and Russia and the rest, right away, for all I know, into the Siberian deserts. And Mr. Pond recalled that across the region where the swamps are deepest and intersected by pools and sluggish rivers, there runs a single road raised on a high causeway, with steep sloping sides, a straight path safe enough for the ordinary pedestrian, but barely broad enough for 2 horsemen to ride abreast. That is the beginning of the story. It concerned a time not very long ago, but a time in which horsemen were still used much more than they are at present, though already rather less as fighters than as couriers. Suffice it to say that it was in one of the many wars that have laid waste to that part of the world, in so far as it is possible to lay waste such a wilderness. Inevitably, it involved the pressure of the Prussian system on the nation of the Poles, but beyond that it is not necessary to expound the politics of the matter or discuss its rights and wrongs here. Let us merely say more lightly that Mr. Pond amused the company with a riddle. "I expect you remember hearing," said Pond, "of all the excitement there was about Paul Petrosky, the poet from Cracow, who did two things rather dangerous in those days: moving from Cracow and going to live in Poznan, and trying to combine being a poet with being a patriot. The town he was living in was held at that moment by the Prussians. It was situated exactly at the eastern end of the long causeway, the Prussian command having naturally taken care to hold the bridgehead of such a solitary bridge across such a sea of swamps. But their base for that particular operation was at the western end of the causeway. The celebrated Marshal von Grock was in general command, and, as it happened, his own old regiment, which was still his favorite regiment of the White Hussars, was posted nearest to the beginning of the great embanked road. Of course, everything was spick and span, down to every detail of the wonderful white uniforms with the flame-colored baldric slung across them, for this was just before the universal use of colors like mud and clay for all the uniforms in the world. I don't blame them for that. I sometimes feel the old epoch of heraldry was a finer thing than all that epoch of imitative coloring that came in with natural history and the worship of chameleons and beetles. Anyhow, this crack regiment of cavalry in the Prussian service still wore its own uniform, and, as you will see, that was another element in the fiasco. But it wasn't only the uniforms, it was the uniformity. The whole thing went wrong because the discipline was too good. Grock's soldiers obeyed him too well, so he simply couldn't do a thing he wanted. "I suppose that's a paradox," said Lawton, heaving a sigh. "Of course it's very clever and all that, but really it's all nonsense, isn't it? I know people say in a general way that there's too much discipline in the German army, but you can't have too much discipline in an army." "But I don't say it in a general way," said Pond plaintively. "I say it in a particular way about this particular case. Grock failed because his soldiers obeyed him. Of course, if one of his soldiers had obeyed him, it wouldn't have been so bad, but when two of his soldiers obeyed him, why, really the poor old devil had no chance." Wotton laughed in a guttural fashion. "I'm glad to hear your new military theory. You'd allow one soldier in a regiment to obey orders, but two soldiers obeying orders strikes you as carrying Prussian discipline a bit too far." "I haven't got any military theory. I'm talking about a military fact," replied Mr. Pond placidly. "It is a military fact that Grock failed, because two of his soldiers obeyed him, and it is a military fact that he might have succeeded if one of them had disobeyed him. You can make up what theories you like about it afterwards." "I don't go in much for theories myself," said Wotton, rather stiffly, as if he had been touched by a trivial insult. At this moment could be seen, striding across the sun-checkered lawn, the large and swaggering figure of Captain Gahagan, the highly incongruous friend and admirer of little Mr. Pond. He had a flaming flower in his buttonhole and a gray top hat slightly slanted upon his ginger-haired head, and he walked with a swagger that seemed to come out of an older period of dandies and duellists, though he himself was comparatively young. So long as his tall, broad-shouldered figure was merely framed against the sunlight, He looked like the embodiment of all arrogance. When he came and sat down, with the sun on his face, there was a sudden contradiction of all this in his very soft brown eyes, which looked sad and even a little anxious. Mr. Pond, interrupting his monologue, was almost in a twitter of apologies. "I'm afraid I'm talking too much, as usual. The truth is, I was talking about that poet, Petrowsky, who was nearly executed in Poznan quite a long time ago. The military authorities on the spot hesitated, and were going to let him go, unless they had direct orders from Marshal von Grock or higher. But Marshal von Grock was quite determined on the poet's death, and sent orders for his execution that very evening. A reprieve was sent afterwards to save him, but as the man carrying the reprieve died on the way, the prisoner was released after all." "But as," repeated Wotton mechanically. "The man carrying the reprieve," added Gehagen, somewhat sarcastically. "Died on the way," muttered Wotton. "Why, then, of course, the prisoner was released," observed Gehagen in a loud and cheerful voice. "All as clear can be. Tell us another of those stories, Grandpapa." "It's a perfectly true story," protested Pond, "and it happened exactly as I say. It isn't any paradox or anything like that. Only, of course, you have to know the story to see how simple it is." "Yes," agreed Gehagen. "I think I should have to know the story before realizing how simple it is." "Better tell us the story and have it done with," said Wotton shortly. Paul Petrowsky was one of those utterly unpractical men who are of prodigious importance in practical politics. His power lay in the fact that he was a national poet, but an international singer. That is, he happened to have a very fine and powerful voice, with which he sang his own patriotic songs in half the concert halls of the world. At home, of course, he was a torch and trumpet of revolutionary hopes, especially then, in the sort of international crisis in which practical politicians disappear and their place is taken by men either more or less practical than themselves. For the true idealist and the real realist have at least the love of action in common, and the practical politician thrives by offering practical objections to any action. What the idealist does may be unworkable, and what the man of action does may be unscrupulous, but in neither trade can a man win a reputation by doing nothing. It is odd that these two extreme types stood at the two extreme ends of that ridge and road among the marshes, the Polish poet, a prisoner in the town at one end, the Prussian soldier, a commander in the camp at the other. For Marshal von Grock was a true Prussian, not only entirely practical, but entirely prosaic. He had never read a line of poetry himself, but he was no fool. He had the sense of reality which belongs to soldiers, and it prevented him from falling into the asinine error of the practical politician. He knew that a poet or a prophet could be as dangerous as an army, and he was resolved that the poet should die. It was his one compliment to poetry, and it was sincere. He was at the moment sitting at a table in his tent. The spiked helmet that he always wore in public was lying in front of him, and his massive head looked quite bald, though it was only closely shaven. His whole face was also shaven, and he had no covering but a pair of very strong spectacles, which alone gave an enigmatic look to his heavy and sagging visage. He turned to a lieutenant standing by, a German of the pale-haired and rather pudding-faced variety, whose blue saucer eyes were staring vacantly. "Lieutenant von Hockheimer," he said, "did you say His Highness would reach the camp tonight?" 7:45, Marshal, replied the lieutenant, who seemed rather reluctant to speak at all, like a large animal learning a new trick of talking. Then there is just time, said Grok, to send you with that order for execution before he arrives. We must serve His Highness in every way, but especially in saving him needless trouble. He will be occupied enough reviewing the troops. See that everything is placed at His Highness's disposal. He will be leaving again for the next outpost in an hour. The large lieutenant seemed partially to come to life, and made a shadowy salute. Of course, Marshal, we must all obey His Highness. I said we must all serve His Highness, said the Marshal. With a sharper movement than usual, he unhooked his heavy spectacles and rapped them down upon the table. If the pale blue eyes of the lieutenant could have seen anything of the sort, or if they could have opened any wider, even if they had, they might as well have opened wide enough at the transformation made by the gesture. It was like the removal of an iron mask. An instant before, Marshal von Grock had looked uncommonly like a rhinoceros, with his heavy folds of leathery cheek and jaw. Now he was a new kind of monster, a rhinoceros with the eyes of an eagle. The bleak blaze of his old eyes would have told almost anybody that he had something within that was not merely heavy, at least that there was a part of him made of steel and not only of iron, for all men live by a spirit, though it were an evil spirit, or one so strange to the commonalty of Christian men that they hardly know whether it be good or evil. I said we must all serve His Highness, repeated Grok. I will speak more plainly, and say we must all save His Highness. Is it not enough for our kings that they should be our gods? Is it not enough for them to be served and saved? It is we who must do the serving and saving. Marshal von Grock seldom talked or even thought, as more theoretical people would count thinking. And it will generally be found that men of his type, when they do happen to think aloud, very much prefer to talk to the dog. They have even a certain patronizing relish in the using long words and elaborate arguments before the dog. It would be unjust to compare Lieutenant von Hockheimer to a dog. It would be unjust to the dog, who is a much more sensitive and vigilant creature. It would be truer to say that Grok, in one of his rare moments of reflection, had the comfort and safety of feeling that he was reflecting aloud in the presence of a cow or a cabbage. Again and again in the history of our royal house, the servant has saved the master, went on Grok, and often got little but kicks for it, from the outer world at least, which always winds sentimentalism against the successful and the strong. But at least we were successful and we were strong. They cursed Bismarck for deceiving even his own master over the Ems telegram. But it made that master the master of the world. Paris was taken, Austria dethroned, and we were safe. Tonight Paul Petrovsky will be dead, and we shall again be safe. That is why I am sending you with his death warrant at once. You understand that you are bearing the order for Petrovsky's instant execution, and that you must remain to see it obeyed. The inarticulate Hockheimer saluted. He could understand that all right. And he had some qualities of the dog. After all, he was as brave as a bulldog, and he could be faithful to the death. You must mount and ride at once, went on Grok, and see that nothing delays or thwarts you. I know for a fact that fool Arnheim is going to release Petrovsky tonight. If no message comes, make all speed. And the lieutenant again saluted and went out into the night, and mounting one of the superb white chargers that were part of the splendor and of that splendid corps, began to ride along the high, narrow road along the ridge, almost like the top of a wall, which overlooked the dark horizon, the dim patterns and decaying colors of those mighty marshes. Almost as the last echoes of his horse hoofs died away along the causeway, Von Grock rose and put on his helmet and his spectacles and came to the door of his tent, but for another reason. The chief men of his staff, in full dress, were already approaching him, and all along the more distant lines there were the sounds of ritual salutation and the shouting of orders. His Highness the Prince had come. His Highness the Prince was something of a contrast, at least in externals, to the men around him, and even in other things something of an exception in his world. He also wore a spiked helmet, but that of another regiment, black with glints of blue steel, and there was something half incongruous and half imaginatively appropriate in some antiquated way in the combination of that helmet with the long, dark, flowing beard amid all those shaven Prussians. As if in keeping with the long, dark, flowing beard, he wore a long, dark, flowing cloak, blue, with one blazing star on it, of the highest royal order, and under the blue cloak he wore a black uniform. Though as German as any man, he was a very different kind of German, and something in his proud but abstracted face was consonant with the legend that the one true passion of his life was music. In truth, the grumbling Grock was inclined to connect with that remote eccentricity the, to him, highly irritating and exasperating fact that the prince did not immediately proceed to the proper review and reception by the troops, already drawn out in all the labyrinthine parade of the military etiquette of their nation, but plunged at once, impatiently, into the subject which Grock most desired to see left alone, the subject of this infernal Pole, his popularity and his peril, for the prince had heard some of the man's songs sung in half the opera houses of Europe. To talk of executing a man like this is madness, like that is madness, said the prince, scowling under his black helmet. He is not a common Pole. He is a European institution. He would be deplored and deified by our allies, by our friends, even by our fellow Germans. Do you want to be the mad woman who murdered Orpheus? Highness, said the marshal, he would be deplored, but he would be dead. He would be deified, but he would be dead. Whatever he means to do, he would never do it. Whatever he is doing, he would do no more. Death is the fact of all facts, and I am rather fond of facts. Do you know nothing of the world? Demanded the prince. I care nothing for the world, answered Grock, beyond the last black and white post of the fatherland. God in heaven, cried his highness, would you have hanged Goethe for a quarrel with the Weimar? For the safety of your royal house, answered Grock, without one instant's hesitation. For the safety of your royal house, answered Grock, without one instant's hesitation. There was a short silence, and the prince said sharply and suddenly, what does this mean? It means that I had not an instant's hesitation, replied the marshal steadily. I have already myself sent orders for the execution of Petrowsky. The prince rose like a great dark eagle, the swirl of his cloak like the sweep of mighty wings, and all men knew that a wrath beyond mere speech had made him a man of action. He did not even speak to Von Grock, but talked across him, at the top of his voice called out to the second in command, General von Vogelin, a stocky man with a square head, who had stood in the background as motionless as a stone. Who has the best horse in your cavalry division, General? Who is the best rider? Arnold von Schacht has a horse that might beat a racehorse, replied the general promptly, and rides it as well as a jockey. He is of the White Hussars." "Very well," said the prince, with the same new ring in his voice. "Let him ride at once after the man with this mad message and stop him. I will give him authority which I think the distinguished marshal will not dispute. Bring me my pen and ink." He sat down, shaking out the cloak, and they brought him writing materials, and he wrote firmly and with a flourish the order overriding all other orders for the reprieve and release of Petrowsky the Pole. Then, amid a dead silence, in the midst of which old Grok stood with an unblinking stare like a stone idol of prehistoric times, he swept out of the room, trailing his mantle and saber. He was so violently displeased that no man dared to remind him of the formal reviewing of the troops. But Arnold von Schacht, a curly-haired active youth, looking more like a boy, but wearing more than one medal on the white uniform of the hussars, clicked his heels and received the folded paper from the prince. Then, striding out, he sprang on his horse and flew along the high, narrow road like a silver arrow or a shooting star. The old marshal went back slowly and calmly to his tent, slowly and calmly removed his spiked helmet and his spectacles and laid them on the table as before. Then he called out to an orderly just outside the tent and bade him fetch Sergeant Schwartz of the White Hussars immediately. A minute later there presented himself before the marshal a gaunt and wiry man, with a great scar across his jaw, rather dark for a German, unless all his colors had been changed by years of smoke and storm and bad weather. He saluted and stood stiffly at attention as the marshal slowly raised his eyes to him, and vast as was the abyss between the imperial marshal, with generals under him, and that one battered non-commissioned officer, it is true that of all the men who have talked in this tale, these two men alone looked and understood each other without words. "Sergeant," said the marshal curtly, "I have seen you twice before, once, I think, when you won the prize of the whole army for marksmanship with the carbine." The sergeant saluted and said nothing. "And once again," went on von Grock, "when you were questioned for shooting that damned old woman who would not give us information about the ambush. The incident caused considerable comment at the time, even in some of our own circles. Influence, however, was exerted on your side, my influence." The sergeant saluted again and was still silent. The marshal continued to speak in a colorless but curiously candid way. "His Highness the Prince has been misinformed and deceived on a point essential to his own safety and that of the fatherland. Under this error he has rashly sent a reprieve to the Pole Petrowsky, who is to be executed tonight. I repeat, who is to be executed tonight. You must immediately ride after von Schacht, who carried the reprieve, and stop him." "I can hardly hope to overtake him, Marshal," said the Sergeant Schwartz. "He has the swiftest horse in the regiment, and is the finest rider." "I did not tell you to overtake him, I told you to stop him," said Grock. Then he spoke more slowly. "A man may be stopped or recalled by various signals, by shouting or shooting." His voice dragged still more ponderously, but without a pause. The discharge of a carbine might attract his attention. And then the dark sergeant saluted him for the third time, and his grim mouth was again shut tight. "The world is changed," said Grock, "not by what is said, or what is blamed or praised, but by what is done. The world never recovers from what is done. At this moment the killing of a man is a thing that must be done." He suddenly flashed his brilliant eyes of steel at the other, and added, "I mean, of course, Petrowsky." And Sergeant Schwartz smiled still more grimly, and he also, lifting the flap of the tent, went out into the darkness and mounted his horse and rode. The last of the three riders was even less likely than the first to indulge in imaginative ideas for their own sake, but because he also was in some imperfect manner human, he could not but feel on such a night and such an errand the oppressiveness of that inhuman landscape. While he rode along that one abrupt ridge, there spread out to infinity all around him something in myriad times more inhuman than the sea, for a man could not swim in it, nor sail boats on it, nor do anything human with it. He could only sink in it, and practically without a struggle. The sergeant felt vaguely the presence of some primordial slime that was neither solid nor liquid nor incapable of any form, and he felt its presence behind the forms of all things. He was atheist, like so many thousands of dull, clever men in northern Germany, but he was not that happier sort of pagan who can see in human progress a natural flowering of the earth. That world before him was not a field in which green or living things evolved and developed and bore fruit. It was only an abyss in which all living things would sink forever, as in a bottomless pit, and the thought hardened him for all the strange duties he had to do in so hateful a world. The gray-green blotches of flattened vegetation seen from above like a sprawling map seemed more like the chart of a disease than a development, and the landlocked pools might have been of poison rather than water. He remembered some humanitarian fuss or other about the poisoning of pools. But the reflections of the sergeant, like most reflections of men not normally reflective, had a root in some subconscious strain on his nerves and his practical intelligence. The truth was that the straight road before him was not only dreary but seemed interminably long. He would never have believed he could have ridden so far without catching some distant glimpse of the man he followed. Von Schacht must indeed have the fleetest of horses to have got so far ahead, for after all he had only started at whatever speed within a comparatively short time. As Schwartz had said, he hardly expected to overtake him, but a very realistic sense of the distances involved had told him that he must very soon come in sight of him. And then, just as despair was beginning to descend and spread itself vaguely over the desolate landscape, he saw him at last. A white spot, which slowly enlarged into something like a white figure, appeared far ahead, riding furiously. It enlarged to that extent because Schwartz managed a spurt of riding furiously himself, but it was large enough to show the faint streak of orange across the white uniform that marked the regiment of the Hussars, the winner of the prize for shooting in that whole army had hit the white of smaller targets than that. He unslung his carbine, and a shock of unnatural noise shook up all the wild fowl for miles upon the silent marshes. But Sergeant Schwartz did not trouble about them. What interested him was that, even at such a distance, he could see the straight white figure turn crooked and alter in shape, as if the man had suddenly grown deformed. He was hanging like a humpback over the saddle, and Schwartz, with his exact eye and long experience, was certain that his victim was shot through the body, and almost certain that he was shot through the heart. Then he brought the horse down with a second shot, and the whole equestrian group heeled over and slipped and slid and vanished into one white flash into the dark fen land below. The hard-headed sergeant was certain that his work was done. Hard-headed men of his sort are generally very precise about what they are doing. That is why they are so often quite wrong about what they do. He had outraged the comradeship that is the soul of armies. He had killed a gallant officer who was in the performance of his duty. He had deceived and defied his sovereign and committed a common murder without excuse of personal quarrel, but he had obeyed his superior officer, and he had helped to kill a Pole. These two last facts for the moment filled his mind, and he rode thoughtfully back again to make his report to Marshal von Grock. He had no doubts about the thoroughness of the work he had done. The man carrying the reprieve was certainly dead, and even if by some miracle he were only dying, he could not conceivably have ridden his dead or dying horse to the town in time to prevent the execution. No, on the whole, it was much more practical and prudent to get back under the wing of his protector, the author of the desperate project. With his whole strength he leaned on the strength of the great marshal. And truly, the great marshal had this greatness about him, that after the monstrous thing he had done, or caused to be done, he disdained to show any fear of facing the facts on the spot, or of the compromising possibilities of keeping in touch with his tool. He and the sergeant, indeed, an hour or so later, actually rode along the ridge together, till they came to a particular place where the marshal dismounted, but bade the other ride on. He wished the sergeant to go forward to the original goal of the riders, to see if all was quiet in the town after the execution, or whether there remained some danger from popular resentment. "Is it here, then, Marshal?" asked the sergeant in a low voice. "I fancied it was further on, but it's a fact that the infernal road seems to lengthen out like a nightmare." "It is here," answered Grock, and he swung himself heavily from saddle and stirrup, and then went to the edge of the long parapet and looked down. The moon had risen over the marshes and gone up, strengthening in splendor, and gleaming on dark waters and green scum. And in the nearest clump of reeds, at the foot of the slope, there lay, as in a sort of luminous and radiant ruin, all that was left of one of those superb white horses and white horsemen of his old brigade. Nor was the identity doubtful. The moon made a sort of aureola of the curled golden hair of young Arnold, the second rider and the bearer of the reprieve, and the same mystical moonshine glittered not only on baldric and buttons, but on the special medals of the young soldier, and the stripes and signs of his degree. Under such a glamorous veil of light, he might almost have been in the white armor of Sir Galahad, and there could scarcely have been a more horrible contrast than that between such fallen grace and youth below, and the rocky and grotesque figure looking down from above. Grock had taken off his helmet again, and though it is impossible that this was the vague shadow of some funereal form of respect, its visible effect was that the queer naked head and neck, like that of a pachyderm, glittered stonily in the moon, like the hairless head and neck of some monster of the age of stone. Raps, or some such etcher of the black, fantastic German schools, might have drawn such a picture of a huge beast as inhuman as a beetle looking down on some broken wings and white and golden armor of some defeated champion of the cherubim. Grock said no prayer, and uttered no pity, but in some dark way his mind was moved, as even the dark and mighty swamp will sometimes move like a living thing, and as such men will, when feeling for the first time faintly on their defense before they know not what. He tried to formulate his only faith and confront it with the stark universe and the staring moon. After and before the deed, the German will is the same. It cannot be broken by changes and by time, like that of those others who repent. It stands outside time like a thing of stone, looking forward and backward with the same face. The silence that followed lasted long enough to please his cold vanity with a certain sense of portent, as if a stone figure had spoken in a valley of silence. But the silence began to thrill once more with a distant whisper, which was the faint throb of horse hoofs, and a moment later the sergeant came galloping, or rather racing, back along the uplifted road, and his scarred and swarthy visage was no longer merely grim, but ghastly in the moon. "Marshal," he said, saluting with strange stiffness, "I've seen Petrovsky the Pole." "Haven't they buried him yet?" asked the marshal, still staring down into some abstraction. "If they have," said Schwartz, "he has rolled the stone away and risen from the dead." He stared in front of him at the moon and marshes, but indeed, though he was far from being a visionary character, it was not these things that he saw, but rather the things that he had just seen. He had indeed seen Paul Petrovsky walking alive and alert down the brilliantly illuminated main avenue of that Polish town to the very beginning of the causeway. There was no mistaking the slim figure with plumes of hair and tuft of Frenchified beard which figured in so many private albums and illustrated magazines. And behind him he had seen that Polish town aflame with flags and firebrands, and a population boiling with triumphant hero worship, though perhaps less hostile to the government than it might have been, since it was rejoicing at the release of its popular hero. "Do you mean," cried Grock with a sudden croaking stridency of voice, "that they have dared to release him in defiance of my message?" Schwartz saluted again and said, "They had already released him, and they have received no message." "Do you ask me, after all this," said Grock, "to believe that no messenger came from our camp at all?" "No messenger at all," said the sergeant. There was a much longer silence, and then Grock said hoarsely, "What in the name of hell has happened? Can you think of anything to explain it all?" "I have seen something," said the sergeant, "which I think does explain it all." When Mr. Pond had told the story up to this point, he paused with an irritating blankness of expression. "Well," said Gahagan impatiently, "and do you know anything that would explain it all?" "Well, I think I do," said Mr. Pond meekly. "You see, I had to worry it out for myself when the report came round to my department. It really did arise from an excess of Prussian obedience. It also arose from an excess of another Prussian weakness, contempt. And of all the passions that blind and madden and mislead men, the worst and is the coldest, contempt." Grock had talked much too comfortably before the cow, and much too confidently before the cabbage. He despised stupid men even on his own staff, and treated von Hockheimer, the first messenger, as a piece of furniture merely because he looked like a fool. But the lieutenant was not such a fool as he looked. He also understood what the great marshal meant, quite as well as the cynical sergeant who had done such dirty work all his life. Hockheimer also understood the marshal's peculiar moral philosophy, that an act is unanswerable even when it is indefensible. He knew that what his commander wanted was simply the corpse of Petrovsky, that he wanted it anyhow, at the expense of any deception of princes or destruction of soldiers. And when he heard a swifter horseman behind him, riding to overtake him, he knew as well as Grock himself that the new messenger must be carrying with him the message of the mercy of the prince. Von Schacht, that very young but gallant officer, looking like the very embodiment of all that more generous tradition of Germany that has been too much neglected in this tale, was worthy of the accident that made him the herald of a more generous policy. He came with the speed of that noble horsemanship that has left behind in it left behind it in Europe the very name of chivalry, calling out to the other in a tone like a herald's trumpet to stop and stand and turn. And von Hockheimer obeyed. He stopped, he reined in his horse, he turned in his saddle, but his hand held the carbine leveled like a pistol, and he shot the boy between the eyes. Then he turned again and rode on, carrying the death warrant of the Pole. Behind him, horse and man had crashed over the edge of the embankment, so that the whole road was clear, and along that clear and open road toiled in his turn the third messenger, marveling at the interminable length of his journey, till he saw at last the unmistakable uniform of a hussar, like a white star disappearing in the distance. But he shot also, only he did not kill the second messenger, but the first. That was why no messenger came alive to the Polish town that night. That was why the prisoner walked out of his prison alive. Do you think it was quite wrong in saying that von Grock had two faithful servants, and one too many?